My name is Laurent Dubois, and I am 67 years old. If you had told me 15 years ago that I would be sitting here today, speaking these words into a camera in my small apartment in Marseille, I would have called you a servant of Satan himself. Back then, I was Elder Laurent of the Sacred Valley community, a man who stood before hundreds of faithful souls every Sunday morning, delivering sermons with the kind of conviction that comes from believing you hold the absolute truth in your hands. I wore my responsibility like armor, polished and gleaming, never imagining that beneath its surface, rust had already begun to spread. The Sacred Valley community wasn't just a church to me and the 300 families who called it home. It was our entire world, nestled in the rolling hills of southern France, about 2 hours from any major city. We had built something that felt eternal there, a place where children grew up knowing exactly what was expected of them, where marriages were arranged with divine guidance, where every major decision in life was made through prayer and consultation with the Council of Elders. I had been part of that council for 12 years, ever since I turned 41, and there was no greater honor I could have imagined. You see, my dear viewers, I didn't stumble into faith. I was born into it, raised by parents who had given their entire lives to the community. My father, Henri Dubois, had been one of the founding members back in 1961, when a small group of devout Christians decided that the modern world had corrupted traditional churches beyond repair. They purchased 700 acres of fertile land and began building what they called God's New Jerusalem, a place where the faithful could live according to biblical principles, away from the temptations and lies of secular society. My mother, Marie, had arrived at 16 as part of the first wave of families who answered the call to join this holy experiment. I was their second child, born in 1957, and from my earliest memories, I knew I was special. Not because I was inherently better than other children, but because I had been chosen by God to be born into His chosen people. We were taught that the outside world was under the influence of the evil one, that governments were corrupt, that other churches had compromised the true gospel, and that only we, the faithful remnant, held the keys to salvation. It was a heavy responsibility, but also a tremendous comfort. When you know with absolute certainty that you are on the right side of eternity, fear becomes something that happens to other people. My childhood was structured around prayer, work, and study. We attended services 3 times a week, with Sunday morning being the most important gathering where the entire community would come together in the Grand Assembly Hall, a beautiful wooden building that my father had helped construct with his own hands. The men sat on the left side, the women on the right, and children in the front rows where the elders could keep watch over them. We had our own school within the community, where we learned reading, writing, and arithmetic alongside intensive biblical studies and community history. The outside world existed, but it was something we observed from a safe distance, like looking at dangerous animals through the bars of a zoo. When I turned 18, I was apprenticed to Brother Michel Rousseau, the community's head carpenter and one of the most respected elders. Michel had no sons of his own, and he took me under his wing with a dedication that shaped not just my woodworking skills, but my entire understanding of what it meant to be a man of God. He taught me that every nail we drove, every beam we raised, every door we hung was an act of worship. The community was growing steadily in those days, with new families arriving every few months, and there was always construction work to be done. New homes, expansions to the school, improvements to the worship hall. My hands learned to create things that would outlast my lifetime, and my heart swelled with the knowledge that I was building God's kingdom on earth. At 23, I married Celeste Moreau, a gentlewoman 3 years my junior who had been raised in the community just as I had been. Our courtship had been supervised by the elders, conducted according to biblical principles, and blessed by the entire congregation. She was everything a godly wife should be. modest, obedient, skilled in domestic arts, and possessed of a quiet faith that never seemed to waver. Our wedding was the social event of the year, with the entire community celebrating as we pledged our lives to each other and to the service of God. We moved into a small house that I had built myself, just 100 meters from the home where I had grown up, and began the blessed work of raising the next generation of God's chosen people. Our first child, David, was born in 1981, followed by Sarah 2 years later, and finally little Mark in 1986. Watching them grow within the protected embrace of the community filled me with a satisfaction deeper than anything I had ever known. They would never have to struggle with the confusion and moral decay that plagued children in the outside world. They would never wonder about their purpose in life or question whether God truly loved them. They had been born into certainty, into a place where every question had already been answered by wiser men than themselves. It was during those early years of fatherhood that I began to show the qualities that would eventually lead to my appointment as an elder. I had a gift for explaining complex theological concepts in simple terms, a natural authority that made other men respect my judgment, and most importantly, an unwavering commitment to the community's teachings that never seemed to falter. When Brother Michel began showing signs of the arthritis that would eventually force his retirement, he recommended me to take over more of the important construction projects. When disputes arose between families, people began coming to me for mediation. When newer members had questions about doctrine or community life, I found myself becoming their unofficial guide and teacher. The elders watched my development with approval. Brother Francois Delacroix, who served as our spiritual leader and had known my family since before I was born, began including me in more serious discussions about community governance. Brother Jean-Paul Mercier, our expert on biblical interpretation, started asking for my input when preparing particularly complex sermons. Brother Antoine Girard, who oversaw all financial matters and business dealings with the outside world, began trusting me with increasingly sensitive information about the community's affairs. I felt myself being groomed for leadership, and the prospect filled me with both excitement and a deep sense of responsibility. When I was formally appointed as an elder at age 41, the ceremony was one of the most moving experiences of my life. Standing before the entire community as Brother Francois laid his hands on my head and prayed for God's blessing on my service, I felt the weight of generations of faithful men who had carried this responsibility before me. My father wept openly in the congregation, and Celeste's face glowed with pride as she watched her husband step into one of the most sacred roles our community could offer. I pledged that night to serve faithfully until my dying breath, to protect the community's purity, and to never compromise the truths that had been entrusted to my care. For the next 12 years, I threw myself into elder duties with complete dedication. I conducted marriage ceremonies for young couples, performed baptisms in the community's pristine lake, delivered sermons that moved people to tears of repentance and joy. I counseled families through difficult times, mediated disputes with wisdom that seemed to come from beyond my own understanding, and helped make the countless administrative decisions that kept our community running smoothly. I traveled to other similar communities across France and Europe, building relationships and sharing insights about how to maintain purity and dedication in an increasingly corrupt world. But if I'm being completely honest with you, and that's why I'm telling this story after all, there were moments even during those golden years when tiny questions would surface in my mind, like bubbles rising from the depths of a still pond. Nothing dramatic or heretical, just small wonderings that I would quickly push away and cover with prayer. Why did our community seem to be the only one that had figured out the correct way to interpret certain biblical passages? Why did some of the wisest and most godly people I met during my travels to other communities have slightly different understandings of doctrines we considered absolutely settled? Why did the outside world, which we were taught was completely under Satan's control, seem to produce people of such obvious kindness and moral courage? These questions never lasted long, and I never spoke them aloud to anyone, not even Celeste. I would simply pray more fervently, study my Bible more intensively, and throw myself more completely into my duties as an elder. The questions would fade, replaced by the warm certainty that came from being surrounded by people who shared my beliefs completely and never seemed to struggle with such foolish doubts. I was Laurent Dubois, elder of the Sacred Valley community, guardian of truth and protector of God's chosen people. Doubt was not in my vocabulary, and even if it had been, I would never have given it permission to take root in my heart. Looking back now, I understand that those early questions were like the first tiny cracks in a dam, barely visible on the surface, easily ignored by anyone who didn't want to see them, but growing stronger with each passing season as the pressure behind them continued to build. The dam would hold for many more years, but its destruction had already begun, set in motion by forces I didn't yet understand and couldn't yet name. The first real crack in my certainty appeared on a Tuesday morning in October 2009, when I was 52 years old and had been serving as an elder for 11 years. I was in my workshop, putting the finishing touches on a set of pews for our new prayer chapel, when Brother Antoine Girard knocked on my door with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Antoine was our financial administrator, a methodical man who handled all our business dealings with the outside world, and in the 28 years I had known him, I had never seen him look uncertain about anything. But that morning, his usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "Laurent," he said, closing the door behind him and glancing around as if he expected someone to be listening, "I need to show you something. But you must promise me this conversation never happened." The request was so unusual that I set down my sandpaper and gave him my complete attention. Antoine had been an elder for almost 30 years, one of Brother Francois's most trusted advisors, and if he was asking for secrecy, there had to be a serious reason. He pulled a folder from under his jacket and spread several documents across my workbench. They appeared to be financial records, bank statements, and correspondence with various organizations that I didn't recognize. As I examined them more closely, trying to understand what I was looking at, Antoine began to explain in a voice barely above a whisper. "These are the community's real financial records," he said, pointing to columns of numbers that seemed impossibly large. "Not the simplified reports we present to the general membership, but the actual accounting of where our money comes from and where it goes." My eyes widened as I began to comprehend the figures. The Sacred Valley community was apparently worth far more than I had ever imagined, with investments in dozens of companies, real estate holdings across 3 countries, and bank accounts that contained millions of euros. But it wasn't the wealth itself that made my hands start to tremble as I turned the pages. It was the nature of some of the investments. Our community, which preached separation from worldly corruption and refused to participate in what we called the Babylon system of modern commerce, was apparently a major shareholder in tobacco companies, alcohol manufacturers, and even weapons contractors. The very industries we condemned from the pulpit on Sunday mornings were generating profits that funded our supposedly pure and holy way of life. "How long have you known about this?" I asked, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears, as if someone else was speaking the words. Antoine's shoulders sagged with what looked like years of accumulated guilt. "I've been managing these accounts for 15 years, ever since Brother Francois asked me to take over from his nephew who moved to Canada. At first, I thought it was just temporary, that we were planning to divest from these problematic investments as soon as practical. But when I brought up my concerns, Francois told me that God works in mysterious ways, and that perhaps we were meant to profit from worldly corruption in order to fund his kingdom on earth." I stared at the documents, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with everything I had been taught and had taught others about our community's principles. We regularly delivered sermons about the importance of moral purity, about refusing to be contaminated by the world's systems of greed and exploitation. Young people were discouraged from pursuing careers that might compromise their spiritual integrity. Families had been counseled to make significant financial sacrifices rather than accept money from sources we considered spiritually questionable. Yet here was evidence that our entire way of life was being subsidized by the very things we claimed to despise. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. "Because I can't carry this knowledge alone anymore," Antoine replied, his voice cracking with emotion, "and because there are other things you need to know, things that go beyond just the financial irregularities." He gathered up the documents and replaced them with another set of papers. These appeared to be correspondence between Brother Francois and various religious organizations around the world, including several groups that we had always been taught to consider dangerous cults. As I read through the letters, a picture began to emerge that shattered another fundamental assumption about our community. We weren't the unique, divinely inspired movement I had always believed we were. Instead, we were part of a loose network of similar groups, all following virtually identical patterns of organization, doctrine, and control. The specific teachings that I had thought were revealed directly to our founders through prayer and biblical study had actually been borrowed from other movements, adapted and refined through decades of experimentation in social control. Brother Francois has been corresponding with the leaders of these other groups for over 20 years, Antoine explained. They share strategies for maintaining member loyalty, techniques for handling dissent, methods for extracting maximum financial commitment from their followers. It's like a professional association for cult leaders, if you'll forgive my bluntness. The word cult hit me like a physical blow. I had heard it applied to our community by outsiders, of course, but we had always dismissed such accusations as persecution from a world that couldn't understand our purity and dedication. Now, seeing the calculated, methodical way our leaders shared techniques for psychological manipulation, I began to wonder if perhaps those outside critics had seen something that we, from the inside, had been unable to recognize. Antoine showed me training materials that had been developed to help community leaders identify potential troublemakers, methods for isolating individuals who asked too many questions, and step-by-step guides for conducting what they called spiritual interventions, intensive counseling sessions designed to break down independent thinking and restore complete obedience to community authority. Reading these documents, I recognized techniques that I myself had been trained to use, methods I had employed countless times in my role as an elder without ever understanding their true psychological purpose. "There's more," Antoine said, though I wasn't sure I was ready to absorb any additional revelations. He showed me records of what the leadership called problem members, individuals who had been quietly expelled from the community over the years, along with detailed notes about why they had been considered threats and what methods had been used to discredit them before their removal. I recognized several names on these lists, good people whom I had been told had chosen to leave because their faith had weakened or because they had been seduced by worldly temptations. But according to these internal records, most of them had actually been forced out because they had discovered information similar to what Antoine was now showing me, or because they had asked questions that the leadership considered dangerous to community stability. Their departures hadn't been failures of faith, as we had been told, but successful operations to remove threats to the leadership's control. The implications of what I was learning began to cascade through my mind like an avalanche. If our financial foundation was built on hypocrisy, if our unique doctrines were borrowed from other groups, if our departed members had been deliberately discredited and expelled for discovering inconvenient truths, then what else about our community might not be what it seemed? How many other assumptions that I had built my entire adult life around might turn out to be carefully constructed illusions. "Why are you trusting me with this information?" I asked Antoine, though I was beginning to suspect I knew the answer. "Because I've been watching you, Laurent. I've seen the way you've started to pause before agreeing with certain decisions in our elder meetings. I've noticed how you've begun asking for more detailed explanations of policies that we used to accept without question. And frankly, because I'm getting old and I need someone younger to help me figure out what to do with all this knowledge." He was right about my growing tendency to question things that I had previously accepted automatically. Over the past year, I had found myself increasingly uncomfortable with some of the community's practices, though I had attributed my discomfort to personal weakness rather than legitimate concerns. When families were separated because one member expressed doubts, when young people were discouraged from pursuing education that might expose them to worldly influences, when members were required to contribute ever-increasing percentages of their income to community projects, I had begun to feel a gnawing sense that something wasn't quite right. But I had always pushed these feelings aside, telling myself that my discomfort was a sign of spiritual immaturity, that true faith required submission to authority, even when I didn't understand the reasoning behind certain decisions. Now, looking at the evidence Antoine had presented, I began to wonder if my instincts had been trying to tell me something important that my indoctrinated mind had been refusing to hear. The conversation lasted for nearly 3 hours, as Antoine shared detail after detail about the gap between our community's public face and its hidden reality. By the time he gathered up his documents and prepared to leave, my entire understanding of my life's work had been fundamentally altered. The community I had devoted myself to serving wasn't the pure, divinely guided haven I had believed it to be. It was a sophisticated operation designed to extract obedience, labor, and money from people who trusted their leaders completely. As I sat alone in my workshop after Antoine left, surrounded by the half-finished pews I had been crafting for our new prayer chapel, I felt as if the ground beneath my feet had suddenly become unstable. Every assumption I had built my identity around was now subject to question. If the Sacred Valley community wasn't what I had believed it to be, then who was I? What had I been doing with my life for the past 30 years? What had I been teaching my children to believe in and dedicate their lives to? My dear friends who are watching this story unfold, I want to pause here for just a moment to speak directly to your hearts. I know that some of you might be experiencing your own moments of questioning, your own uncomfortable recognition that perhaps things you've been taught to accept without question might deserve a closer look. If that's the case, please know that you're not alone in this journey, and that questioning isn't the same as abandoning faith. Sometimes it's the first step toward finding a more authentic relationship with truth itself. Your willingness to listen to these difficult stories, to sit with uncomfortable truths, tells me that you have the kind of courage that this world desperately needs. I hope you'll stay with me as this story continues to unfold, because while the path ahead was dark and difficult, it ultimately led to a freedom I never could have imagined. If this story is touching something deep in your heart, I'd be honored if you'd consider subscribing to this channel. Not just to hear more stories like mine, but to become part of a community of people who believe that truth, however painful it might be initially, is always worth pursuing. And please share in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because knowing that these words are reaching people in different corners of the world gives me strength to continue sharing these memories that are sometimes difficult to revisit. The weeks following my conversation with Antoine passed in a strange, dreamlike haze, where everything familiar seemed to have taken on a different quality, like looking at a landscape you've known all your life through glass that has suddenly been tinted a different color. I continued performing my duties as an elder, conducting meetings, counseling troubled members, delivering sermons on Sunday mornings, but every word I spoke felt hollow, every gesture mechanical. I found myself studying the faces of my fellow community members during our gatherings, wondering how many of them suspected what I now knew, and how many were as blindly trusting as I had been just a few weeks earlier. Celeste noticed the change in me almost immediately, though she interpreted my distracted behavior as stress from my increased responsibilities within the Elder Council. She would find me staring out our kitchen window for long periods, lost in thoughts I couldn't share with her, and she would gently suggest that perhaps I was taking on too many burdens, that I should delegate more of my duties to younger men who were eager to serve. Her innocent concern only deepened my anguish, because I realized that eventually I would have to decide whether to burden her with the knowledge that was eating away at my peace of mind, or whether to carry this terrible secret alone indefinitely. My children, now adults with families of their own within the community, also began to notice that something was troubling their father. David, who had followed in my footsteps as a carpenter and was being considered for appointment as a junior elder, started asking if there were problems within the community leadership that I was worried about. Sarah, who taught at our community school and had always looked up to me as the embodiment of spiritual wisdom, commented that my recent sermons seemed to lack their usual conviction and fire. Even Mark, the youngest and most carefree of my children, mentioned that I seemed to be carrying some kind of heavy burden that was affecting my typically cheerful disposition. Their observations were accurate, of course. I was carrying a burden that grew heavier each day, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the appearance of the confident, certain elder that everyone expected me to be. During community meetings, when Brother Francois would announce new policies or explain changes in our interpretation of biblical doctrines, I found myself analyzing his words not as divine revelation filtered through a holy vessel, but as calculated statements designed to maintain control and extract compliance from trusting followers. The techniques that Antoine had shown me in those training materials became impossible to ignore once I knew what to look for. I began to notice how our leaders used fear of spiritual contamination to discourage members from developing relationships with outsiders, how they portrayed any questioning of community policies as evidence of spiritual weakness or demonic influence, how they carefully controlled the flow of information from the outside world to prevent members from accessing perspectives that might challenge our beliefs. These patterns had always been present, but I had interpreted them as necessary protections for our spiritual purity rather than methods of psychological control. The financial revelations that Antoine had shared with me became particularly troubling as I observed how our leaders continued to preach about the importance of financial sacrifice while knowing that our community was actually supported by investments in the very industries we condemned. When young families were counseled to reduce their standard of living in order to contribute more to community projects, when elderly members were encouraged to leave their life savings to the Sacred Valley community in their wills, when working-age adults were pressured to turn over larger percentages of their salaries to support our holy work, I now understood that these sacrifices were not actually necessary for our community's survival, but were instead methods for concentrating wealth and power in the hands of our leadership. 3 months after my first conversation with Antoine, he approached me again, this time with an even more disturbing set of revelations. He had been conducting his own investigation into the community's history, using his access to financial records and correspondence files to piece together a picture of how our supposedly organic, spiritually guided movement had actually developed over the decades. "Laurent," he told me as we sat in his office after the other elders had left our weekly administrative meeting, I need to show you what I've discovered about our community's real origins, but I warn you that this information is going to be even more difficult to process than what I shared with you before. The documents he presented painted a picture of calculated deception that stretched back to the very founding of our community. Brother Francois, whom we all revered as a humble servant who had been called by God to establish our haven of purity, had actually spent several years studying other religious movements and deliberately incorporating their most effective techniques for member recruitment, retention, and control. The original revelation that had inspired him to purchase our land and begin gathering followers had been preceded by extensive correspondence with leaders of similar groups, detailed analysis of their successes and failures, and careful planning of how to avoid the mistakes that had caused other communities to collapse or lose members. Even more disturbing was evidence that several of our most sacred traditions and doctrines had been borrowed wholesale from other movements, sometimes with only minor modifications to make them appear original. The special prayers that we believed had been revealed directly to Brother Francois through divine inspiration had actually been adapted from liturgies used by completely unrelated religious groups. Our distinctive interpretations of biblical prophecy, which we thought marked us as uniquely blessed with spiritual insight, had been developed by combining elements from various existing theological systems and presenting them as if they were fresh revelations. "Look at this," Antoine said, showing me a letter dated 15 years before my birth, in which Brother Francois discussed with another cult leader the importance of creating what he called manufactured uniqueness, the illusion that their followers were part of something special and unprecedented, when in reality they were simply replicating successful patterns that had been proven effective in other contexts. As I absorbed this information, I felt something inside me that I can only describe as a spiritual collapse. It wasn't just that I was learning uncomfortable facts about my community's operations. It was that I was discovering that my entire identity had been built on a foundation of deliberate lies. The sense of special calling that had sustained me through decades of sacrifice and service, the conviction that I was part of God's chosen remnant on earth, the pride I had taken in helping to build something pure and sacred, all of it had been manufactured through psychological manipulation techniques that were as calculated as any marketing campaign. The implications for my children were particularly devastating to contemplate. I had raised David, Sarah, and Mark to believe that they were part of something sacred and eternal, that their lives had special meaning because they had been born into God's chosen community. I had encouraged them to make significant sacrifices for the sake of maintaining our spiritual purity, to limit their relationships with outsiders, to subordinate their individual dreams and ambitions to the collective good of our movement. Now I was learning that what I had presented to them as divine truth was actually a carefully constructed system of control designed to benefit our leaders at the expense of ordinary members. But perhaps the most painful revelation was understanding how I myself had been used as an instrument of deception. In my role as an elder, I had counseled countless individuals and families, always believing that I was offering them divine wisdom and guidance. I had performed marriage ceremonies, confident that I was blessing unions that God had ordained. I had delivered sermons that moved people to tears of repentance and commitment, thinking that I was serving as a vessel for holy truth. I had participated in disciplinary actions against members who questioned our teachings, convinced that I was protecting the spiritual welfare of our community. Now I understood that I had actually been functioning as an agent of psychological manipulation, using my sincere beliefs and genuine care for people as tools to enforce a system of control that I hadn't even known I was serving. The trust that people had placed in me, the respect they had shown for my spiritual authority, the influence I had exercised over their most important life decisions. All of it had been built on a foundation of lies that I had been too indoctrinated to recognize. The weight of this realization was crushing. I began experiencing what I now recognize as symptoms of severe depression, though at the time I interpreted my emotional turmoil as a spiritual crisis. I found it difficult to sleep, often lying awake for hours, replaying conversations and situations from my years as an elder, wondering how many people I had inadvertently harmed through my well-intentioned but misguided counsel. I lost my appetite and began losing weight noticeably enough that Celeste started expressing serious concern about my health. Most difficult of all was the growing awareness that I would have to make a choice about what to do with the knowledge I had gained. I could continue serving as an elder, performing my duties, while knowing that I was participating in a system of deception, essentially living a lie for the rest of my life. Or I could find some way to act on what I had learned, knowing that any attempt to expose the truth or even to quietly withdraw from leadership would likely result in my being branded as an apostate and cut off from everything and everyone I had ever known. The thought of losing my family, my friends, my home, my entire social world was terrifying. But the thought of continuing to deceive people I cared about, of spending the rest of my life pretending to believe things I now knew to be false, was equally unbearable. I felt trapped in a situation where every possible course of action would result in tremendous loss and pain, not just for myself, but for everyone I loved. During this period of agonizing indecision, I began to pray more intensely than I had since my youth, though my prayers had changed dramatically in character. Instead of asking for guidance in serving the community more effectively, I found myself pleading for wisdom, to know what was true and what was false, for courage to act with integrity regardless of the consequences, and for forgiveness for all the ways I had unknowingly participated in deceiving others. These prayers felt different from any I had offered before, more desperate, more honest, and strangely more connected to something that felt genuinely divine. It was during one of these intense prayer sessions, alone in my workshop late at night while Celeste slept, that I experienced what I can only describe as a moment of clarity that changed the trajectory of my life forever. I realized that my loyalty had to be to truth itself, not to any human institution that claimed to represent truth. If the Sacred Valley community was built on deception, then serving it faithfully was actually a betrayal of everything I truly believed in. The choice wasn't between my community and my doubts. It was between integrity and complicity, between honesty and continued participation in a lie. The decision to act on my newfound understanding came not through any dramatic revelation or sudden burst of courage, but rather through a gradual erosion of my ability to continue living a double life. By the spring of 2010, nearly 6 months after Antoine had first opened my eyes to the reality behind our community's facade, I found myself physically unable to deliver sermons with the same conviction I had once possessed. My voice would falter when I tried to proclaim doctrines I no longer believed. My hands would tremble when I held up our sacred texts to quote passages I now knew had been deliberately misinterpreted to serve the leadership's agenda. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine disciplinary hearing for a young man named Thomas Martineau, who had been caught reading books from outside our community without permission from the elders. Thomas was 24 years old, the son of faithful members who had joined our community when he was just a child, and he had always been one of our most promising young people. Intelligent, hard-working, and genuinely devoted to what he believed was God's truth, he reminded me painfully of myself at that age. The books that had gotten Thomas into trouble were not pornography or occult materials or anything that would have been considered genuinely harmful by most reasonable standards. They were academic works on history, philosophy, and comparative religion that he had borrowed from a public library during a rare trip to the nearby town for community business. When questioned by Brother Francois about why he had felt the need to seek knowledge outside our approved materials, Thomas had given an answer that struck me like a lightning bolt. I wanted to better understand our beliefs by learning what other people thought about the same questions we wrestle with, he had said, with innocent sincerity. I thought that if our truth is really from God, it should be strong enough to withstand comparison with other ideas. I wasn't trying to rebel against our teachings. I was trying to strengthen my faith by testing it. The other elders reacted to this explanation with the kind of horror typically reserved for confessions of serious moral transgressions. Brother Francois's face grew red with indignation as he explained to Thomas that seeking wisdom from worldly sources was evidence of spiritual pride. That true humility required accepting the guidance of God's appointed representatives without question, and that his desire to test our divinely revealed truth showed that Satan had already gained a foothold in his heart. As I sat in that disciplinary hearing, listening to my fellow elders condemn a young man whose only crime had been intellectual curiosity, I felt something snap inside me like a cable stretched beyond its breaking point. This was exactly the kind of scene that the training materials Antoine had shown me were designed to create. A public demonstration of what happened to people who dared to think independently, a warning to other community members about the consequences of asking unauthorized questions. But more than that, I realized I was looking at my own son David's future, or my daughter Sarah's, or my youngest boy Mark's. If any of them ever developed the kind of honest intellectual curiosity that Thomas was displaying, they would face the same kind of psychological assault, the same accusations of spiritual weakness and demonic influence. The community I had spent my life building and defending would destroy my own children's minds, just as thoroughly as it was destroying Thomas's, if they ever showed signs of independent thinking. When Brother Francois asked for my opinion on what disciplinary action should be taken against Thomas, I found myself saying words I had never planned to speak. I think Thomas is asking exactly the kinds of questions that any intelligent person should ask, and I think our reaction to his curiosity says more about our own insecurity than it does about his spiritual condition. The silence that followed my statement was so complete that I could hear the old buildings settling around us, the distant sound of children playing in the community courtyard, the whisper of wind through the trees outside our window. My fellow elders stared at me as if I had suddenly begun speaking in a foreign language, their faces registering shock, confusion, and growing alarm. Brother Francois was the first to recover his composure, though I could see the effort it cost him to maintain his usual authoritative demeanor. "Brother Laurent," he said carefully, "I'm concerned that you may be experiencing some kind of spiritual crisis that's affecting your judgment. Perhaps we should postpone this hearing and schedule a private consultation to discuss what's troubling you." But something had been unleashed inside me that could not be contained by diplomatic language or threats of private discipline. 6 months of suppressed knowledge and accumulated guilt came pouring out of me in a torrent that surprised me as much as it shocked everyone else in the room. "What's troubling me," I said, standing up from my chair and feeling steadier than I had in months, "is the realization that we've been lying to ourselves and to everyone who trusts us. What's troubling me is discovering that our community's financial foundation is built on investments in the very industries we condemn from our pulpit. What's troubling me is learning that our supposedly unique doctrines were borrowed from other groups, and that our leaders have been using psychological manipulation techniques to control people who believe we're serving God." The explosion of outraged voices that followed my words made it impossible for any single person to be heard clearly. But I caught fragments of accusation and condemnation flying around the room like shrapnel. Apostate, possessed by demons, corrupted by Satan, betraying sacred trust. All the familiar phrases that I had heard applied to other people who had dared to question our system, now being directed at me with the full force of righteous indignation. "Brother Antoine, who had been sitting quietly throughout the meeting, caught my eye and gave me a barely perceptible nod of understanding and support. At least I was not completely alone in this room, though I knew that his public backing would likely mean the end of his own position within the community hierarchy. When the shouting finally died down, Brother Francois fixed me with a stare that contained more coldness than I had ever seen in his eyes before. "Brother Laurent," he said with deadly calm, "you will report to my office tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock for a comprehensive spiritual evaluation. Until that meeting concludes, you are suspended from all elder duties and forbidden from discussing these concerns with any other community members. I strongly suggest you spend the evening in prayer and reflection, asking God to cleanse your mind of whatever poison has infected your thinking." I walked home from that meeting knowing that my life as I had known it for 53 years was effectively over. There would be no going back to my former position, no restoration of the respect and authority I had once enjoyed, no comfortable return to the certainty that had sustained me through decades of faithful service. I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, spoken truths that could not be unspoken, awakened to a reality that made it impossible for me to continue sleeping peacefully in the illusion I had called home. Celeste knew immediately that something catastrophic had happened, though she couldn't have imagined the scope of what I was about to tell her. We sat in our kitchen that night, the same kitchen where we had shared thousands of meals and conversations over the years, where we had planned our children's futures and celebrated their milestones, where we had prayed together before every major decision in our lives. The familiar surroundings made what I had to tell her even more surreal and heartbreaking. "My darling," I said, taking her hands in mine and feeling how fragile they seemed, "I need to tell you things about our community that are going to be very difficult to hear, and then I need you to help me decide what we're going to do with the rest of our lives." Over the next 3 hours, I shared with Celeste everything that Antoine had revealed to me, everything I had discovered through my own investigation, and everything I had realized about the true nature of the system we had devoted our lives to serving. I watched her face change as each new revelation hit her, saw her move through the same stages of shock, denial, anger, and heartbroken recognition that I had experienced over the previous months. Her first concern, predictably, was for our children and grandchildren. "Laurent," she whispered, "if what you're telling me is true, then we've raised our babies in a lie. We've taught them to build their entire lives around something that isn't real. What's going to happen to them when this all comes out?" That was the question I had been dreading most, because I knew the answer was likely to be devastating. David had already been following the path toward elder appointment, investing his identity and self-worth in the very system I was now prepared to expose as fraudulent. Sarah had dedicated her career to teaching our community's children, shaping young minds according to principles she believed were divinely inspired. Mark, though still young enough to potentially recover from the shock, had never known any other way of life and would be completely unprepared for existence outside our closed community. "I don't know what's going to happen to any of us," I admitted to Celeste. "All I know is that I can't continue pretending to believe things I know are false, and I can't keep participating in deceiving people I care about. Tomorrow morning I'm going to meet with Francois, and I'm going to tell him that either our community starts operating with complete honesty and transparency, or I'm going to start sharing what I know with everyone who deserves to hear it." Celeste was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands folded in her lap, processing implications that were as overwhelming for her as they had been for me. Finally, she looked up with tears streaming down her cheeks, but with a determination in her voice that reminded me of why I had fallen in love with her 30 years earlier. "If you're right about all this," she said, "then we have to do what's right, regardless of what it costs us. I married a man of integrity, and I'd rather lose everything while staying true to who we are than keep everything by living a lie. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever happens after that, we'll face it together." That night, neither of us slept more than a few minutes at a time. We lay in our bed, holding each other close, talking quietly about memories of our life together and wondering what kind of future we were about to step into. Outside our window, the Sacred Valley community continued its peaceful existence, unaware that the comfortable certainties that had sustained it for nearly 50 years were about to be challenged in a way that would change everything for everyone who called it home. As dawn approached, I realized that I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of peace that came from knowing I was about to act with complete honesty, regardless of the consequences. For the first time since Antoine had first shown me those financial documents, I was going to be able to look at myself in the mirror without feeling like I was living a lie. The meeting in Brother Francois's office the next morning began exactly as I had expected it would, with what our leadership manual would have called a spiritual intervention, designed to break down my resistance and restore my obedience to community authority. Francois had arranged the furniture in his office to create maximum psychological pressure. My chair was positioned lower than his, with bright morning sunlight streaming through the window behind him so that I would be forced to squint while he remained comfortably in shadow. He had also invited Brother Jean-Paul and Antoine to serve as witnesses, though Antoine's presence was clearly intended more as a warning to him than as support for the process. For nearly an hour, Francois employed every technique I now recognized from the training materials Antoine had shown me. He spoke in gentle, condescending tones about how Satan often attacked God's most faithful servants through seeds of doubt, how spiritual pride could make even mature believers susceptible to deception, how my many years of faithful service proved that my current crisis was temporary and could be overcome through humble submission to divine authority. He quoted scripture after scripture about the importance of unity, obedience, and trust in God's appointed representatives, weaving together a tapestry of biblical language that was designed to make me feel guilty for questioning and ashamed of my independent thinking. Under normal circumstances, this approach would probably have been effective. I had been conditioned for decades to respond to such appeals with automatic compliance, to interpret any resistance on my part as evidence of spiritual weakness that needed to be corrected through greater submission. But the knowledge I now possessed about the calculated nature of these techniques made them powerless to affect me. Instead of feeling convicted by Francois's words, I found myself analyzing his methods, recognizing the psychological manipulation behind his seemingly caring concern. When he finally finished his lengthy appeal and asked me to confess my error and commit to returning to faithful obedience, I gave him an answer that I could see he had not expected. "Francois, I appreciate that you believe you're helping me. But I need you to address the specific issues I raised yesterday. I need you to explain how our community can claim to be separated from worldly corruption while profiting from investments in tobacco, alcohol, and weapons manufacturing. I need you to explain why our supposedly unique doctrines are actually borrowed from other groups. And I need you to explain why we use psychological manipulation techniques to control people instead of simply teaching truth and letting them make informed decisions." The change in Francois's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The gentle pastoral concern vanished from his voice, replaced by a coldness that made me understand for the first time how dangerous he could be when his authority was directly challenged. "Laurent," he said, "you're asking questions that demonstrate you've already chosen rebellion over faith. Those documents you've been shown were taken out of context, and your interpretation of our business practices shows that you don't understand the complexities of operating a community in the modern world. But more importantly, your demand that I justify God's arrangements to your human understanding reveals a level of spiritual pride that makes it impossible for us to help you unless you first humble yourself and acknowledge your error." It was a masterful response, I had to admit. By refusing to address the substance of my concerns and instead attacking my motives for raising them, Francois was following the exact playbook that the leadership training materials had outlined for dealing with problematic members. He was making it clear that no amount of evidence would ever be considered sufficient to justify questioning community authority, because questioning itself was being defined as inherently sinful regardless of what prompted it. But I had passed the point where such tactics could silence me. "The documents I've seen aren't taken out of context," I replied calmly. "They're financial records, correspondence, and training materials that show a clear pattern of deception and manipulation. If you believe I've misunderstood something, then show me where I'm wrong. Open the books completely, invite independent auditors to examine our finances. Let our members read the correspondence between you and other cult leaders. If we have nothing to hide, transparency should be welcomed, not feared." The word cult hung in the air between us like a physical presence. I hadn't planned to use such direct language, but once it was spoken, I realized it represented exactly what I had come to understand about our community. We weren't a church, or a spiritual movement, or a haven of righteousness. We were a cult, with all the manipulation, control, and exploitation that term implied. Francois's reaction confirmed that he understood the significance of what I had said. He stood up from his chair, his face flushed with anger that he was no longer attempting to disguise behind pastoral concern. "Laurent Dubois," he said with formal authority, "you are hereby removed from all positions of responsibility within this community. You have 48 hours to decide whether you will repent of your rebellion and submit yourself to corrective discipline, or whether you will be formally expelled as an apostate and enemy of God's people. I suggest you use that time to consider what such expulsion will mean for your wife, your children, and your place in God's eternal kingdom." As I walked out of that office, I felt a strange combination of relief and terror. The relief came from knowing that I would never again have to pretend to believe things I knew were false, never again have to participate in deceiving people I cared about, never again have to suppress my conscience in service of a system that exploited trust and devotion for the benefit of its leaders. The terror came from understanding that the life I had known for over 5 decades was about to end, and that the consequences would extend far beyond my own personal losses. The next 48 hours were among the most difficult of my entire life. Word of my confrontation with Francois spread through the community, with the speed that gossip always travels in close-knit social groups, though the version that most people heard bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred. According to the rumors that reached my family, I had suffered some kind of mental breakdown, possibly brought on by demonic possession, and had made wild accusations against our beloved leaders based on materials that Satan had somehow planted in our community to destroy our faith. David was the first of my children to approach me, his face showing the kind of anguish that comes from watching someone you love apparently losing their mind. "Papa," he said, "Brother Francois told me that you've been influenced by apostate literature and that you're spreading lies about our community. Please tell me this isn't true. Please tell me you haven't thrown away everything we believe in." Looking into my son's eyes, seeing the genuine pain and confusion there, I faced the hardest decision of my parental life. I could lie to him, tell him that I had made a mistake and would be returning to faithful service, preserve his comfortable certainties at the cost of my own integrity. Or I could tell him the truth, knowing that it would shatter his world just as thoroughly as mine had been shattered, but giving him the opportunity to make informed choices about his own future. "David," I said, "everything I taught you about the importance of truth and integrity was correct, even if some of the specific beliefs I taught you were wrong. I've discovered that our community's leaders have been deceiving us about many important things, and I can't continue participating in that deception. I know this is painful to hear, and I know it calls into question everything you've built your life around. But I need you to know that leaving this community doesn't mean leaving God or abandoning faith. It means seeking a more authentic relationship with truth itself." The conversation that followed was one of the most heartbreaking of my life. David, who had inherited my tendency toward analytical thinking, asked detailed questions about the evidence I had seen, the conclusions I had drawn, and the implications for our family's future. The more I explained, the more I could see him struggling to reconcile the father he had always trusted with information that contradicted everything he had been raised to believe. Sarah's reaction was different, but equally painful. When she came to see me, she was angry rather than confused, convinced that I had betrayed not only our family, but God himself. "How could you do this to us?" she demanded through tears of rage and grief. "How could you throw away decades of faithful service because of some documents that could easily have been fabricated by our enemies? Don't you realize that Satan attacks God's people by making them doubt the very foundations of their faith?" Mark, still young enough to be more concerned with immediate practical consequences than theological implications, asked the question that pierced my heart most deeply. "Papa, does this mean we're going to have to leave our home? Does this mean I won't be able to see my friends anymore? Does this mean our family is going to be broken apart?" I couldn't give him reassuring answers because I didn't know what was going to happen to any of us. All I could tell him was that sometimes doing the right thing requires sacrificing things we care about, and that integrity was more important than comfort or security. Celeste, who had spent the previous day processing her own shock and grief, became my anchor during this period of family crisis. She supported my decision publicly, despite the enormous social pressure she faced from other community women who couldn't understand how she could stand by a husband who had apparently lost his mind. Her loyalty gave me strength to continue standing by my convictions when everything in my environment was designed to break down my resolve. On the evening before my deadline for response to Francois's ultimatum, Antoine came to our house after dark, using back paths to avoid being seen by community members who might report his visit to the leadership. He had made his own decision about how to respond to the crisis, and his choice both relieved and saddened me. "Laurent," he said, "I can't do what you're doing. I don't have your courage, and I don't have your strength. I have grandchildren in this community, family members who would be destroyed if I were expelled. I'm going to confess to Francois that I made an error in sharing those documents with you. Accept whatever discipline he imposes, and try to find some way to live with the knowledge I carry while protecting the people I love." I understood his decision completely, and I didn't judge him for making a choice that was different from mine. Everyone has to find their own way of dealing with impossible situations, and Antoine's responsibilities were different from mine. But his visit made me realize how isolated I was about to become, how few people would be able to support me in the path I had chosen. The next morning, I returned to Francois's office with my final answer. "I cannot repent of seeking truth," I told him, "and I cannot promise to remain silent about deception that harms people I care about. If that makes me an apostate in your eyes, then I accept that judgment, but I will not compromise my integrity to preserve my position in a system built on lies." The formal announcement of my expulsion was made at the Sunday morning service 2 days later. Francois delivered a carefully crafted sermon about how Satan sometimes infiltrates God's people through individuals who appear righteous but are actually agents of destruction. He explained that such people must be removed from the community to protect the spiritual welfare of faithful members, and that anyone who maintained contact with expelled apostates would be putting their own salvation at risk. As I sat in the back of the assembly hall for the last time, listening to my former colleague describe me as an enemy of God, while members of the congregation I had served for decades nodded in agreement, I experienced a profound sense of loss that went beyond anything I had expected. These people had been my entire world, my extended family, my spiritual community, and now they were being taught to view me as a dangerous enemy who had chosen evil over good. But underlying the grief was something unexpected, a sense of freedom that I had never experienced before. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely free to think my own thoughts, ask my own questions, and form my own conclusions about truth and reality. No human authority stood between me and my relationship with God. No institutional loyalty prevented me from following my conscience wherever it might lead. My dear friends who have stayed with me through this entire difficult story, I want you to know that sharing these memories has been both painful and healing. If you've made it this far, it tells me that you have the kind of courage and commitment to truth that our world desperately needs. I hope that my experience might help someone else who is facing their own moment of choice between comfortable deception and difficult honesty. The path I chose was not easy, and the costs were higher than I could have imagined, but I can say with complete certainty that living authentically is worth any price you might have to pay for it. If this story has touched your heart, if it has given you courage to ask your own difficult questions or to trust your own conscience when it conflicts with institutional pressure, then I would be deeply honored if you would subscribe to this channel and become part of a community of people who believe that truth, compassion, and intellectual honesty are sacred values worth defending. Please tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. And if you feel comfortable sharing, tell me about your own experiences with institutions that demanded unquestioning obedience. Your stories matter just as much as mine, and together we can create a space where people feel safe to speak their truth without fear of judgment or rejection. Thank you for giving me the privilege of sharing my journey with you, and remember that courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing what is right, despite the fear. May you find the strength to live authentically, whatever that might cost you.